I guess this question is for the atheists and the skeptics out there. How can consciousness exist in the cosmos without a living organism?
Okay, this is okay. Remember what I said earlier on. I mean, I come from I am an agnostic in terms of religious beliefs. I am an absolute skeptic on most things. I'm a huge fan of Richard Dawkins. What I find difficult with people like Richard Dawkins and James Randi is when they start attacking the people who are trying to do the science. I think the targets that they normally hit are great, but they're missing the point in many, many ways. The idea is, reflect, if you are a skeptic, just reflect on the fact for 1 second that you are a conscious something existing in a physical universe. You are looking outside of your eyes at a universe. You think that universe that you are looking at out there is real. Get this, if you read any book on consciousness studies, you are called a naive realist. You are naive because you're not thinking deeply about exactly what you are seeing. For example, you look at the wall in front of you. What is happening is photons of light are bouncing off that wall and are stimulating you're going through your pupil, stimulating your retina. In the retina, those photons, and of course we don't even go to the point of how photons move, and of course one photon hits another and the signal is transferred from one photon to another, so even the photons that are hitting your retina are not the same, or your pupil are not the same photons that are hitting your retina. We won't even go into that, but effectively it's then turned into an electronic signal which is sent to the deepest, darkest part of your mind, the back of your head, where you have the visual cortex. Somehow, magically, the whole image, which is basically an inverted postage stamp image, remember, has already been converted into electronic signals, so it's no longer the photons and no longer the original photons, is recreated into the three-dimensional visual field that you see that's actually surrounding you at the moment. That is not what is out there. All that was stimulated by was a photon. I call this term electromagnetic chauvinism. It's the idea that what is out there is what I see. If you were a bat, Thomas Nagel wrote a very, very famous philosophical paper a few years ago, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. Again, serious philosopher, and a very serious point. A bat perceives reality in a totally different way to the way we perceive reality. So which is the real reality? The reality the bat sees, or the reality we see? I read recently in my quantum physics course, they were pointing out how you can use certain subatomic particles, like photons, to see the center of the sun. So if our eyes were called neutrinos, imagine the scenario that our eyes can process not photons, but neutrinos. And it's neutrinos that stimulate the visual cortex. We'd be able to see straight through to the center of the sun. Neutrinos can travel through anything. You wouldn't even see physical matter, because physical matter wouldn't be there, because for a neutrino, there is no physical matter. So therefore, we then start looking at the solidity of things. The floor you are standing on is solid, or so you think. It's not. It's 99.999 empty space. What is there is effectively everything in the universe is made up of quarks and electrons. That is it. There is nothing else. An electron is a point particle. Nobody's ever seen an electron, and it is a point particle. Literally, it's a point. The light you see are photons. Photons travel at the speed of light, and they have zero mass. So from the point of view of a particle, and this is a really important point, from the point of view of a particle, the universe is timeless. If you are traveling at the speed of light, time stops. So a particle of light that came out of the Big Bang, that hits your retina now, that's been bouncing around the universe for 13 billion years, as far as it is concerned, it's the same moment. The Big Bang and it hitting your eye is exactly the same moment. These things don't have mass. If they don't have mass, they don't have physical reactions within space. Also, you've got to take into account space itself. You take these subatomic particles out of space, you take the fields that propagate those, what is there? Nothing. Nothing. It is no thing. So what it is, it's digital information. What we perceive is information, and it's information that is prime. And this is exactly what Tyrrell is saying in his books.
I want to talk a little bit about reincarnation, maybe from a Buddhist sense. I know you've researched many others as well, but in a Buddhist sense or a Western research, people think you incarnate once. Some people think you reincarnate several times. People think you reincarnate to come back to fix past judgments or flaws. There's many. Maybe just tell me about your beliefs or research and where it has led you to and your philosophy on the matter.
Okay, there are two things. The first point I make about reincarnation is it makes no logical sense to me to be reborn as somebody else. We learn by our experiences. In other words, through my life, I have done things that I wish I hadn't done, and I learn from those experiences. If I was reborn as somebody else with a blank slate that I don't even remember who I was in my previous life, how can that ever be a learning experience? In other words, I die today and I'm reborn, I don't know, as an Inuit in Greenland, with no memories of me living in England or anything. I just start that life again. That's not iterative, that's not developmental. It does nothing. You have to, if it is a learning process, you have to know what you did wrong. For instance, if reincarnation and karma works, that you'll be actually reborn in a lower caste or reborn in some other way, you have to be aware of the fact of why you've been reborn in a lower caste. Otherwise, you don't learn anything. Okay. I think reincarnation is far more complex than that. What in fact is happening in reincarnation is, and it's again going back to the final thesis of my book, The Infinite Minefield. To quote Bill Hicks, the American comedian, we are a single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively within the information field. In other words, you and I, and everybody that's listening here, we are one consciousness. But we are embodied within a simulation to make us believe we're individuals. This is not my original idea. Professor Bernard Hayes has been writing this about his book, The God Theory. There are various other writers around the world that have been touching upon this idea. Dr. Ball, I think his name is, Martin Ball, has written a book called The Theological Paradigm, because he brings in, as I do, dimethyltryptamine and the role of dimethyltryptamine within the brain, the role of ayahuasca within the brain, and the evidential information we have from the work of Rick Strassman. The idea is that we are embodied souls as part of a greater whole. The reason being, and it was something that I was discussing with a group of my readers recently, it's the idea that, say you are, for want of a better term, the entity, God, or whatever we want to call itself, and you exist in this internal now. You're going to get bored. So what do? You create universes, and in those universes you create beings that are part of you. And what you do then is you suffer from what Plato called amnesis. You forget who you are. In the ancient Greek myth of the ferryman and everything else, when people died, they used to drink from the waters of the river Lethe. And the river Lethe, according to ancient Greek legend, was the river of forgetting. What you did was you drank from the river of Lethe, you forgot who you were, and you went back and you were reborn again, back into the simulation, not remembering. But remember, I argue that the daemon part of you does remember. Okay, so you go back into the simulation by having, and then what the collective consciousness does then is that it forgets what it is and lives every life that it could possibly live within the simulation, not knowing the fact. So feeling pain, feeling delight, feeling love, feeling pleasure, and they're not allowing itself to know. And again, some of you guys out there might know I've recently written a biography of the American science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick, in his exegesis, very much discusses this very idea. And in one of his novels, called The Divine Invasion, he actually has a character who is God, who's forgotten he's God. A guy called Emmanuel or Manny. Okay? So this is a known precept. And of course, if you look into Hinduism, it's Brahma. You know, it's the the ideas of mystical Judaism or the Kabbalah. It's the Or Ein Sof. It's the backdrop of everything, and that's the 0 point field. It's a conscious field of information and energy. Now, that means when you have reincarnations and people have they get taken back to previous lives, they're picking up information from the information field. It doesn't mean they live that life. It means that at that point in time, they have accessed that particular part of the information field and have regurgitated it during hypnotic trances. Because there's too much information of people who have been regressed to a person who did exist. And I don't discredit that. I have friends of mine who are professional regressionists who have actually given me positive evidence that people do have previous lives or can experience previous lives. And I think this is the argument. You experience the previous lives. It doesn't mean you were you. Because of course you were that person. Because you're everybody else as well.
In a sense, you have the Dawkins out there, the biologists, and not to pick on anyone in particular. I guess this is for general biology. They say the brain produces the mind. Do you go head to head with these people? Do you challenge them? Do you seek that? Do you want that? Do you want people to absorb this into biological research as well?
Totally. It's called epiphenomenalism, and it's the idea that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of the brain. Now, I'll give an example of just how difficult this area is. I think it was in 2001, I may remain corrected on this, but Professor Ramachandran did the Reith lectures, which are broadcast on the BBC, and he was discussing about neurology, and he was discussing about the unusual areas of neurology that his work goes into. I mean, Ramachandran is a fascinating writer in this area, as is people like Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, and various other books, Awakenings and Hallucinations. And these are leading-edge neurologists and psychologists, psychiatrists. They're also fascinated by this mystery of how inanimate matter can create consciousness. Now, at the moment, I'm reading a 600-page tome on this from a materialist reductionist science, arguing how you can argue that consciousness is part of the brain and is generated by the brain. I'm happy to read this, and I'm reading through it. And before people criticize me as well, I'm also aware of Daniel Dennett, and I've read Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained. I'm perfectly aware of these. I do my research, okay? Daniel Dennett is somebody, he's called an eliminative materialist. He's like the Churchlands and various other individuals who get this, guys, actually believe that you are fooling yourself into believing you're conscious. So you're sitting watching me now, but you're not really there. You only think you're there because your brain is fooling you into thinking you're conscious. Now, how you can fool something that's not conscious in the first place is a mystery to me. In other words, something has to be conscious to be fooled. But they seem to think they get themselves into these intellectual messes that they can't get themselves out of. And then something magical happens. And this is the whole mystery of consciousness. There is no way at the moment that I can understand how chemical reactions can create qualia, the intensity of red, the perception of red, the images you see inside your head. These are images, hypnagogic imagery. Just before you go to sleep, you see these three-dimensional images out there in space. The people argue hallucinogenic drugs, they're really bad for you and everything. DMT, they give you hallucinations. You start looking and find out the definition of hallucination, or how a brain can create hallucinations. They haven't got the first clue. What they do is, I call it labelism. They give it a label. They call it an hallucination. Oh, we've explained it then. You have an out-of-the-body experience. It's an hallucination. What's an hallucination? Ask them the next question, and it's, and they get lost, and they get themselves in a complete mess. I'm not condemning materialist reductionist science. It works. You're watching this on your computer. The material, the things that have filmed this and everything else, they work. But all I'm saying is it's incomplete. And until we understand and incorporate consciousness into our science, we're going down a gum tree. Can you go down a gum tree? I don't know.
In a way then, okay, so if the brain doesn't produce, if the consciousness is outside the body and there is evidence to support that, and there is research to support that, does that imply God? Does that imply spirituality? Do you look at that? Is that a taboo subject that doesn't really need to be looked at in terms of the research science, or is there many other things to look at or address the questions of?
Well, the first thing is the brain, I would argue, is a form of receiver, for want of a better term. It receives from the field. The idea that Henri Bergson argued this years ago, at the end of the 19th century. The idea that the brain is a receiver. But not only is the brain a receiver, it's also an attenuator, and it cuts down information as well. but it's receiving information. It is processing information the same way a computer processor processes information from the hard drive of the computer. So it's analogous. Whenever I use the term computer, people accuse me of thinking like it's a computer like hardware, software and everything. Anything that can actually effectively generate information is a computer. You know, look up the term of what we mean when we call something a computer. It doesn't mean something that's a screen and a keyboard. It's far more subtle than that. But it is a computer. So where does God come into this? Well, I always shy away I don't shy away from theology. Theology fascinates me. I write about theology, and in the Infinite Mind Field, I have a great deal of theology in there. I understand some of the theological principles. I'm fascinated by Gnosticism. I'm fascinated by most religions. And when I was at university, I actually studied and wrote a paper on the sociology of religion and the sociology of belief. So I'm well grounded in these things. You know, if anybody wants to argue I'm not qualified in quantum physics, I may not be, but I am qualified in terms of the sociology of religion and such like, and the sociology of belief. But the idea that what is God? God is everything. It's panpsychism. You know, it's the work of people like Spinoza. You know, Benedict Spinoza came up with very much this kind of philosophy. We are confusing it. We are all God. We are all emanations of God. It's what the Gnostics would call the shard from the pleroma that actually hides deep within us. It's what every single mystical tradition, from Sufism to Gnosticism to the Kabbalah, to every mystical tradition, both Western mystical tradition and Eastern mystical tradition, teach. We are one. Look for the God within. Because this is the major teaching of everything. And it has taken me decades of my life, 6 decades of my life, to actually come to this conclusion. And as I get older, it becomes more and more instinctively evident. But I'm trying to do the science. Now, ultimately, whether I'll be ever able to do this, because science is reductive and you need to repeat your experiments to prove that your science is right. I can never do that because you can't do the science of consciousness. Not yet, anyway. Doesn't mean that we might be able to.
Let's talk altered states of consciousness. You can talk maybe entheogens if you like. Not that that is the only... there is acoustically induced altered states of consciousness, and then there's people, for example, like the San people in South Africa, that pass out after 24 hours of rhythmic dance with extreme fatigue. But these induced altered states of consciousness, does that lend you any enhancement of your research? Is that a big area of research for you?
It's probably one of the major areas, again, in the infinite mind field. I'm particularly fascinated by the effect of entheogens. Either entheogens such as dimethyltryptamine when it's actually ingested, but I'm also intrigued by the way in which certain shamanic drumming, various other dance techniques and various other ways of getting into altered states of consciousness, deep states of meditation. I think all of these facilitate the release of dimethyltryptamine by the pineal gland. And I argue that dimethyltryptamine is endogenously, that is, internally created. Now, I know there'll be people out there and they'll say, hold on. There is no proof that dimethyltryptamine has actually been found in the brain. They will argue it's in the blood, it's in the liver, it's various other places. It's never been found in the brain. Do your homework. There's a lady called Jima Borogin at the University of Michigan. 18 months ago, she did a series of experiments with rats. They found dimethyltryptamine in the pineal gland of live rats. They also know that dimethyltryptamine is a neurotransmitter. They have found something called the trace amine-associated receptors in the brain. Trace amine-associated receptors actually prove they're receptor sites for neurotransmitters. These receptor sites for neurotransmitters are actually designed to work with dimethyltryptamine, which effectively means that dimethyltryptamine is what is our link with the program, as it were. Now, again, fascinating piece of an aside information here, and I was amazed when I came across this. At the 49th day of gestation, the pineal gland, or the pituitary pineal body, is at the back of the throat. Okay? It then slowly, as the baby matures, it moves up into the centre of the head, leaving a very slight duct. Now, if it is the case that under certain altered states of consciousness, or certain techniques that will generate the pineal gland to release dimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine is excreted by the pineal gland and tiny bits of it drip down to the back of the throat. Now, any individuals out there that actually do meditation and do particular forms of meditation, people who are involved in things like Kashmiri Shaivism and other people, will know something called the transcendental nectar. This is a taste, an acidic taste that people claim they get at the back of the throat when they go into altered states of consciousness. I argue this is dimethyltryptamine dripping down the back of the throat that you're tasting. So here we're suddenly having some very interesting areas about the way in which the brain modulates reality through entheogens such as dimethyltryptamine. And again, as an aside, the word entheogen, which we use, actually literally means God within. It's finding the God within. And Martin W. Ball, in his book, The Theological Paradigm, is well worth reading, because Martin, again, does the science of this, as does Roni Dougal as well, who's another great researcher in these areas. Don't just go for me on these. There's an awful lot of people in this field. And we are all pulling in the same direction in terms of this.
I think even recent research by London University said that even psilocybin mushroom compounds, they can produce synesthesia, and also they do something to the thalamus to slow down time as well. Yes,
I've heard this, and of course synesthesia. Again, just for the people out there, synesthesia is sometimes an overlapping of the perceptions, so that you will hear red or you will taste blue. And again, there is an argument to say that probably we were all at an earlier time all synesthetic. And it's only over a period of time that we've evolved away from being synesthetic. Indeed, my next book is going to be on temporal lobe epilepsy, migraine. It's called The Opening the Doors of Perception, which I've already got a book deal for, which I'll be starting writing later this year. And in this, I will be discussing savant syndrome, autism, dyslexia, TLE, and particularly I'm fascinated by the side effects of Alzheimer's, terminal lucidity, because something really bizarre happened. My mother has Alzheimer's, and I've watched her deteriorate. But there are 2 or 3 things that have happened during my mother's Alzheimer's that are absolutely inexplicable. Totally and utterly inexplicable, which I'll be talking about in the book.
Just to let not to drag on Tammet then, the guy, he's one of the best examples of synesthesia and epilepsy. He's value of pi to 22,500 places. You can memorize a language in a week. When you see that level of intellect and creativity with people who have synesthesia, that have these remarkable syllogism or skills that we just find incredulous. Does that mean that the Akashic field, or where we go when we die, we're in this creative universe where we know and feel and sense everything?
I believe that savants such as Trammett and such as Kim Peake, these individuals are tuning into the field. And that the neurological structures within their brain, and in the next book I'm wanting to do this, I'm wanting to do the neurochemical basis of how this information is drawn up. And I think it is to do again with the pineal gland, and I think the pineal gland has access via things called microtubules. And microtubules are little pieces of tubulin that actually hold the cells together, the neurons of the brain. There are literally trillions of these. And the research has shown, and the research particularly of people such as something called the orchestrated reduction idea of Stuart Hammerhoff and Roger Penrose. Yeah. And Hammerhoff and Penrose have been working on the idea that the structures in the brain, these microtubules, actually draw up information from the information field. And in fact, what is really intriguing with microtubules is that microtubules are actually like mini twin slit experiments. They actually fire off, single photon light is fired from either side of the microtubule, which causes an interference pattern. Okay, so we know interference patterns from lasers. So therefore, if there are trillions of these things creating interference patterns in your brain, is this what creates out here? The holographic nature of the universe? And again, before we go on about this, just very, very quickly, if you look at the world of work of people like Maldacena and various other writers, Lee Smolin and various other individuals, they are arguing that the universe itself is a huge hologram. There are literally trillions of tiny units sending in signals from the edge of the universe. I can't go into detail now, but it is to do with something called Hawking radiation. And again, I say to people, don't take my word for this, look it up. It's called Hawking radiation, and Hawking radiation is radiation that is actually given off from a black hole. Silly impossible, because a black hole supposedly sucks everything in, but it doesn't. There's energy that comes off it. And from this, researchers have said this is proof, and it's a very big argument. And again, you want to read about this, pick up any copy of New Scientist. Don't pick up your book from your New Age bookshop. Go to New Scientist. This is real leading edge stuff. That this universe is a hologram. In fact, in 2000, 2001, the front picture of Scientific American had a headline, "Is the universe a hologram?"
Wow.